Everything doesn't need to be an overwhelming success to be a success. Like, I think that's really kind of been my takeaway since leaving Relay, has been kind of being able to celebrate moderate success. Because I would say that everything that I'm doing right now is a moderate success by any reasonable metric.
What's up, everyone? Jay Miller here, bringing another Productivity in Tech podcast. My guest this week is someone that I have been following for several years now as a podcaster. Steve Lubitz is now the host of the Off Curve podcast, a podcast that he does in his car. Now, if you've heard the name Steve Lubitz before, it's probably from one of his previous shows on either the 5x5 network or Relay FM. Steve has been podcasting for several years, talking about all things from video games to technology. And Steve recently, in the last couple of years, took a break from talking tech and instead just started talking about some of the things that he enjoys. Now, Steve is a techie himself. He's a data architect, and we get into how the side of a data architect impacts him not only as a podcaster, but also as a gamer, and how it comes to looking at data and making sure that you're getting the right conclusions from the data that you are compiling. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you want to hear more, be sure to head over to our Ko-fi page. There will be a link in the show notes for that. And remember, if with any donation, one time or reoccurring, you gain access to the bonus feed for this show and all of the other J&J Media shows, which I have to be honest, we have a few shows, but I think this is the only one with a bonus feed right now. But I do know of some other ones, especially with the Waffling Taylors. Jamie and Squidgy over there are in the UK are doing some really fun stuff. And I'm sure that we're going to have a bonus episode of Ask a Brit coming up soon as well. But here it is, my conversation with Steve Lubitz. I'm here with Steve Lubitz today. Do you go by Steve or Steven? Because I think I've heard both. I want to say it's just Steve, right?
It's Steve, unless you're mad at me, and then it's Steven.
I get that. So Steve is a podcaster. He is also a Hearthstone player, which if you listen to my new solo podcast, I talk about my fascination with Hearthstone and some of the other games. And Steve was someone that I listened to before I got into podcasting, when I was interested in dabbling in podcasting, and the overall voice and attitude that Steve brought to the shows that he did was one that I don't necessarily try to like copy, but one I try to be cognizant of. Like, I want to be real, and like Steve has always had that realness, just as he's talked about, between video games, political issues, social issues, like anything, like I feel like Steve is going to give it to me straight. So when I found out that he was an avid Hearthstone player, before I played Hearthstone, I was like, nerd. And then afterwards, I started playing Hearthstone, and I was like, oh man, Steve plays Hearthstone, but I have no way of hearing about it. And then I happened to be following him on Twitter, and I saw that he had a podcast called Off Curve, and I was like, yes, new podcast. And when I found out it was about Hearthstone, I was like, now I'm the nerd. So we're going to talk a lot about that stuff. But Steve, introduce yourself, I guess, to talk a little bit more about Steve outside of the recording booth.
Yeah, so, podcasting is something I do as a hobby, and it's something I've done as a hobby actually for a really long time. I first did my first podcast about fantasy football back in 2005, which was when podcasting was first starting. I remember reading an article about it in Wired magazine, and I had just gotten an iPod, and I got like Leo Laporte's like radio show that I was downloading and listening to. And I decided that was something that I wanted to do on my own, and I just kind of figured it out, and I figured out I'd never done like any audio at all, and just kind of figured it out, and I roped a buddy in, and we just started talking about fantasy football. We had, a good number of listeners at the time, and I was also doing like just kind of like an audio blog with my wife for a while until we had our second kid, which ended up being our second and our third kid at the same time. And then that was kind of like taking up a little bit too much time, and you know, I kind of stepped back. And then in 2014, I was friends with Brianna Wu, who is a game developer. She recently ran for Congress up here in Massachusetts, and you may also know her if you follow any of the Gamergate stuff. And over the last few years, she was unfortunately a target of that. But you know, I had just been to PAX East that year because that's, you know, in my backyard, and I'd said that I was thinking about starting to do a podcast again. She's like, let's do it. And then before I knew it, she had roped in Maddie Myers, who I believe is a managing editor at Kotaku now, and Georgia Dow from iMore, and we were doing Isometric, and that eventually got picked up by 5x5, and then we eventually moved to Relay FM, which is where it's a fairly large podcasting network in the tech space. And then after we kind of went through some changes, one of our co-hosts left. We changed over to a general tech show, and we did that for a while. And then around 2017, like around the fall there, I was just started to feel like I wasn't really in it, and I wasn't like I've always been kind of a video game buff, but I'm a programmer. I'm actually a data architect as my day job. So, you know, I keep up with technology, but it's never really been something that I've been passionate about talking about outside of work. And, you know, we made the switch, and it worked for a while. And then I just kind of was feeling like I was not 100% in it, and I decided to back away from the show. And then we just decided to end it at that point. I was playing a lot more Hearthstone. I was playing it at a much higher level than I had been in the past. And what it was kind of a running joke on Isometric and Disruption that I was not allowed to talk about Hearthstone because it was kind of they were going to have an intervention for me pretty soon if I brought it up one more time. So it was clear that was not. I think when I hit Legend in Hearthstone, which is like the highest that you can get in the competitive format, I was allowed to talk about it for 10 minutes of that show, and after that, not again. So, but I was kind of having a lot of thoughts about the game, and I felt like I discovered Discord, which is basically Slack for nerds, and I was in a few Hearthstone Discords, and I found myself just typing the same thing out over and over again, and I decided, you know what, I want to just record this so that I don't have to type it over and over again. And it was around that time that Anchor, which is right now they're like a full-on podcasting shop, but at the time they were like this weird startup that was doing like bite-sized radio, and they just announced a feature where you could record a podcast and publish it as a podcast feed. So I decided I couldn't really spend any more time than I already was on podcasting, but I could use the time when I was sitting in the car to record. So that's what I just started doing. I just kind of like hang a pair of iPhone earbuds over my rearview mirror and have one ear in and one ear out because that's legal in Massachusetts. And I just talk to myself for 35-40 minutes about Hearthstone. And I mean, it's been something that I just kind of felt like I was doing for me. And I think that's probably like the best kind of podcast is the one that you're just kind of doing because that's the kind of podcast you would want to listen to. And, you know, it's something that people have been enjoying. So I've been kind of enjoying just doing that. I've been getting into streaming on Twitch like once a week, and I've also been doing play-by-play commentary for smaller tournaments, which it's been really just kind of a fun extension of all the things that I've been doing from podcasting.
It's really cool that you're able to look at all of these different websites that are devoted to helping Hearthstone players understand what's going on in the game, like kind of a state of the game. I think one of them is actually called the Meta Report, but understanding what's happening in the game at the present time. And one of the cool things is a lot of people will look at this, and this is, we could talk all day about some of my gripes about Hearthstone, in that a lot of it is no longer, let's find creative ways to make awesome decks that work. Instead, let's go to a website, copy and paste the link, and then see how well we can play that deck that was pre-assigned to us. But
I mean, I'll tell you that even in other card games that I'm playing, because I'm not just playing Hearthstone, I'm playing other card games, I just don't talk about them on the internet as much. But even there, like even where you don't have the kind of data that's being collected, it's still just people grabbing decks and from sites and playing them. There just isn't as much, you know, it's not as narrow as it is in Hearthstone, because there are a number of plugins that are used by a lot of professional players and you know, aspiring professional players or tryhards like me, that is taking like even individual game data and then aggregating all that up and then making it available to say like this deck, this collection of 30 cards has the best win rate.
I won't get into that, but you're able to take that to the next level. You're able to look at the data that's being presented and analyze it even further and use some of the refining tools to really make a valuable decision on not just an entire deck, but individual card choices in that deck.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing that, you know, I do data architecture so much that it's hard to turn it off sometimes. And the thing with any sort of big data set, and this is Hearthstone, this is business, this is anything, is that it can be kind of overwhelming to interpret all the data, and it's also very easy to read into things what you think it's telling you or what you want it to tell you, but not actually what it's going to tell you. And a lot of, like, you know, there's a lot of going back to the old logic fallacies that you need to even apply when you're looking at data in a dashboard. And it's on, some of that is on the person who's designing it, to be frank, because a good dashboard is designed to be clear about what it's telling its users and not let them take away alternate conclusions that are incorrect. So some of the episodes that I've recorded recently are about some of the statistics that some of these show. Like, there's a statistic that's when it's showing you a list of 30 cards in the deck of played win rate. So very simply, they can track all the games down to what cards were played. And so if you played this card, you won 57% of the time or whatever. And people were taking that and you know, saying, well, this card is bad because it has a 30% win rate or whatever. And it's something that I spent a lot of time over, actually multiple episodes. This happens, like, comes up like once a year, really, where talking about how, correlation is not causation. Like, yes, you played that card and you won the game, but did you win that game because you played the card? That's not telling you that. It's telling you that you played this card and you won this game, but it's not establishing a link there. And they may have won that game because they didn't play the card and they were just playing cards because they were being a jerk and showing the opponent what all the cards in their hand were that they could have killed them with before they actually killed them.
Also, I really think HS Replay should include, like, don't be a jerk, like, plays in their statistics. Like, 30% of the time this was played just because the person's a jerk.
Yeah.
So I would love that.
That's some advanced machine learning they would have to put together to figure that out, I think. And that's something that a dashboard like that doesn't tell you, and a metric like that should be designed to either filter out some of that noise or not show a metric in that way to lead people down a path like that. So that was kind of some of the criticism that I was taking of one of those sites. But again, it's something that it's hard to know that when you don't do these things for a living. And that's why I felt like I needed to kind of record that episode and bring that criticism to bear from my own experience, because it's very easy to criticize something like this when you haven't done it. I've done a number of these dashboards and I know what the pitfalls are, and it's from that perspective that I was bringing that to Hearthstone and kind of my two worlds colliding, as it were.
One of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to try a little experiment where I think of some of the biggest things that people think about in, of course, productivity in tech. So productivity, entrepreneurship, having a passion or a hobby, and getting your opinion on it from the mind of a data architect or Hearthstone player, your choice. So the first one is, a lot of people aren't talking about the thing that I'm doing, therefore the thing that I am doing must be bad. Is that something that you have had experience with or dealt with in the past?
I think there's a lot of imposter syndrome in general, and there's a lot of looking at metrics to determine whether you're being successful or not. And this is actually something I struggled with when I left Disruption, because I knew when I was leaving that podcast, and I was leaving, I mean, and to be clear, like, getting myself on a major podcast network was a dream of mine for a long time. And when I was leaving that show and not going to another one that was on the network, I knew that I was basically saying goodbye to that. I was saying goodbye to a fairly large audience, all things considered. And I was saying, I knew that some people like you would follow me. Like, I knew that that was going to happen, and I was not, kind of just abandoning myself into the void. But I was definitely walking away from a significant, something that a lot of people don't get to do. Let's just put it that way. And I knew that I was going to be doing the show that I'm doing, but it was going to be a much smaller audience. And even then it was probably about half to a quarter of the size that it is now. And I think that it's very easy to look at numbers and derive value from them. It's very easy to look at Twitter followers or podcast downloads or web hits or your rank in Hearthstone or whatever, and let that dictate your value. And I think that ultimately your value is what you get out of it. Like, I would be doing Off Curve if nobody was listening, or if one or two people were listening. I just recently started up my own Discord for the podcast, and I was very honestly convinced it was going to be me and like my one friend who I had asked to mod for me. and it's because I'm constantly convinced nobody's listening, and I look at the numbers and I know that they are, but it doesn't matter because I'm still happy doing it, and I'm happy just putting that content out there, and I enjoy doing it, and I do value all the feedback that I do get. But I mean, if I'm looking at the numbers compared to when I was on Relay, they're not even close. But I know that I'm getting just as much value out of that fraction of the audience size as I was on Relay, if not more so, because I'm truly passionate now. And I mean, not to say that I wasn't at the time when I was passionate about what I was talking about when I was talking about it, but I wasn't. I'm really enjoying what I'm talking about and what I'm doing, and I know that the people who are listening are really enjoying what I'm putting out, and that's worth more than the raw listener count that I would be looking at if I was just looking at what my listeners are now, even a year later, versus what they were on Relay.
That is something that I have struggled with a lot, especially in rebooting this podcast. So I'm sure you're probably not familiar with this, but this podcast ran for 2.5 years, and then I got sick and literally just shut the podcast down, and took a year to deal with some mental health issues, to deal with some physical health issues, to deal with the fact that I was a brand new father. So there was a lot going on in my life, and I had to make the decision to shutter this idea of I'm going to be a professional podcaster. And what is interesting with that is when it left, we never had sponsors. We had patrons and we had members in a premium community, and I had no problem giving everybody their money back. Like, that was perfectly fine. I was breaking even anyway, so it was like no big deal. But to see that mass exodus from my audience, to see people that I had never interacted with that mentioned like, oh man, what's a good technology podcast? And, here's one of my favorites. Yeah. And they bring up your podcast and you're like, oh, I wanted to talk with them.
But yeah, I mean, and I definitely I know exactly what you're talking about, because that month, I would say full month after we ended Disruption was really, really hard. Really hard. And, getting all the tweets from people who I hadn't heard from in over a year, didn't know that they were still listening to the show. I mean, I was, when you told me that you had been listening since Isometric, I don't get that often now. I mean, I know that there are a few people who have followed me to Off Curve. I know that there are, and I was privileged in the fact that I was not starting from nothing when I was doing that show either. But even then, all the people that came out, after the show was ended and tweeting about, oh, I'm devastated, or I'm really sad. I'm gonna miss hearing your voice. And it's like, and with Disruption, especially because of all the Gamergate stuff, we were never able to start really any sort of a community. Like, one of the benefits of doing a podcast now, and one of the reasons that I decided to start the Discord, was to have a place for that. But and one of the reasons that I didn't do it for so long was because of that. Because we had a whole bunch of griefers raid the live stream for Disruption at one point, and then that was the end of live streaming. And so I'd always kind of been a little bit nervous about opening up a community like that. But I think that had we had that for Disruption, maybe, I don't know if it would have made a difference or not, because I think that at the end of the day, it still was not 100%, what I came in wanting to talk about. So it still would have been better for me. And there were other things like scheduling, and working with advertisers is not nearly as easy as it would appear from listening to people just reading ad spots in some of those shows. There's actually a lot of back and forth and stuff that goes into that's not apparent. That's kind of some additional overhead. But had we had something like a Discord where we could see a community forming around the show, like I do have with Off Curve, I don't know if that would have made a difference or not. But even without that, right? Like, it's just a matter of whatever you're putting into the world, like, you should want to put it out there because you want it to exist. And if people enjoy that or not, like, that's great, and obviously that's the goal, and any creator wants their stuff to be seen or heard or experienced. But at the end of the day, it has value whether it is seen by one person or 1,000 or 10,000 or 1,000,000. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily lacking value just because the numbers say it's not as popular as something else.
I always give a shout out to my number ones, and they know who they are. Those are the people that existed in our Slack team even after the podcast disappeared. Those people, I am so glad that I was able to find them, because at one point in my life, I relied on them more than anybody else. There's a thing that we do every morning in our Slack team, and that's literally, we either say good morning, we either give a coffee emoji or a tea emoji, and somebody start doing a yoga emoji. They might get kicked out tomorrow. I don't know. No, I'm just kidding.
I don't know how I feel about that. Yeah. That's a little bit too close to exercise for my taste.
Exactly. But for over a year, we did that. And whether there were 40 people in the team turned into 20 people in the team, turned into 4 people in the team. And that was one thing that always happened. And it was like a thermometer. It was a way to see how everyone was doing, not just in their productivity life, but then also to be there for one another when you're going through those, I'm starting to doubt my ability to create these things. And that is where I am glad that you came out and did, Off Curve, because when things kind of came to a point where Disruption came to an end, this was around the time of, if I remember correctly, this was near the time of, Charlottesville. This was...
Yeah, it was about, we ended it in January. Charlottesville would have been the August just prior, yeah.
And there was so much going on in the climate where I kind of relied on, okay, how are my internet people feeling right now in a world that whether you're conservative, liberal, whatever, there's a lot of stupid crap going on, and people are getting hurt because of it. And I stumbled onto Off Curve, and I was happy when I stumbled onto it, because it was like, okay, this person that I used to hear from all the time left. I finally found that person again. It wasn't like I was really hunting that hard, but it was like, it's kind of that thing when like you're looking for something and you finally give up on finding it, only to then find it and be so happy that you found it.
Yeah.
And not only, it came in a time where I was like, hey, I'm going to try this Hearthstone thing. And it's weird because during the 2 or 3 years that I was listening to your show every single week, I would never talk to you. But in the span of you streaming, once a week, like I see the notification pop up and like I immediately join the stream, even if I'm like working or doing something else, because I now see that value of just existing and letting people know that you exist. Because my first thought was like, okay, people are being like jerks in the chat and people are just getting fed up with it, so the stream ended. And like you could tell it was tense. And I have a million more questions about that old podcasting thing. But at the same time, none of that matters because you're doing something that you enjoy. And like you said, even if you're doing it for 3 people, that's what's most important.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and streaming's kind of weird that way too, because I literally am doing it for like 3 people sometimes. And it is a way that, I mean, but it's also, I think it lends itself to interaction a little bit more because it is real time as opposed to a podcast where you're kind of responding to something after the fact. And even like you get into this weird thing where you're listening to it, but it could have been in editing for like 3 days. So you're trying to respond to something that somebody said and they may not even remember what they were talking about. But you're just listening to it. So there's kind of like that delay there. Whereas like when you're streaming, you're all kind of experiencing everything together. Like maybe there's a 15-second delay, but it's not like, several days. And it does kind of lend more to that kind of real time, interaction. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be about what's happening in the game. Like sometimes we're just chatting and we're just talking about stuff. And, I'm talking through my plays while I'm playing the game, but I'm also just kind of like hanging out and I'm just giving, firing up the stream to give people a place to hang out, which is also, valuable in and of itself too.
So this will be my last question before we cut to the after show, which I always remind people, hey, you listening right now, with the stuff in your ears, while you're jamming out or on the road or whatever, the conversation isn't going to stop here. Like there's a whole nother after show, which if you want to learn more about that, go to my Ko-Fi page. It's ko-fi.com/J&J Media. What is that? That's the media company that I run where I help people do podcasts and send out newsletters and YouTube content and all this other stuff. That's all I'm going to say about that. Last question for me before we jump into the after show. Now that you are a professional streamers and no longer professional podcasters, how would you use your skills as a data architect to advance your career as a streamer, if that's something that you even want to do?
I mean, I think that there are probably things that I could be doing in terms of looking at the times that I'm streaming and seeing how many people are able to sign on and then like min-maxing, when I stream to, how many people are likely to show up and maybe timing that around like people who are likely to host me. Like there's a lot of black magic you could probably do. I just kind of, I don't really want to take streaming that seriously, to be honest. Like, again, this is something that I'm doing because I want to do it and I just want people to hang out. And I'm not, I mean, I guess I say that about everything that I'm doing. Like I just put ads on Off Curve for the first time, like this past week. But even then I feel bad about taking money, which is like my own imposter syndrome hang up. Like asking for money for this thing as though it's, it's like ascribing a certain amount of value or a certain amount of commitment or whatever. I don't know what my hang up is, but even then with the streaming, like I feel like I don't want, I mean, I'd love to be making money off of it. I'd love to have a larger audience, but I think there's also something kind of great about it being a small community. And I don't think everything needs to be like, everything doesn't need to be an overwhelming success to be a success. Like, I think that's really kind of been my takeaway since leaving Relay has been kind of being able to celebrate moderate success. because I would say that everything that I'm doing right now is a moderate success by any reasonable metric. And I've been, because again, being on a network, we had orders of magnitude larger listeners than I have right now. And I know that there are streamers that have orders of magnitude larger streamers. Like I top out at, I feel like maybe 15 or 20 like 20 if I get a good host. I'll get like 20 viewers, and that's fine, right? Like I'm enjoying being available and having a place to hang out for those 10, 15 people. And that's good enough, right? So I think that I'm very likely to min-max anything where I really want to be the best at something. And that goes into my heartstone, because like one of the things that I've kind of taken with me is wanting to be good at the game and wanting to be a legend player. And I've taken that and I've done what needs to be done to do that. I don't need to do that for everything in life. I kind of have to pick my battles to some extent. And I'm going to be much happier on looking back at whatever I've done if I've, been moderately successful and happy, than going overboard and making it into a second or a third or a fourth job and, making it something that I have to do. I'm much happier now doing these things because I want to do them every week than, once you have a commitment from an advertiser in a network, you're committed to releasing an episode by a certain time every week, like it or not. Schedule conflicts, being sick, you just don't feel it, you don't have anything to talk about, does not matter. You need to release an episode by that time every week, one way or another. And I'm, which is not to say that I didn't enjoy it, but, that does start to wear on you. And since I've left, I've been very careful about doing everything that I do in a way that is not imposing commitments on myself, which allows me to enjoy it more. Because I know that whenever I'm putting content out, it's because I want to do it, not because I have to do it or because something is requiring me to do it. And that's been a much more enjoyable way for me to be a content creator than maybe a year ago.
I really love that answer. And this is coming from someone who at one point in his life did nothing but dream to be on a major podcasting network. And then I started realizing that major podcasting networks aren't in the podcasting business. They're in the advertisement business. Like you're selling razors and picture frames and all of these other things and mattresses that, you're selling these things and people come for the conversation, but the conversation could potentially stop happening if the ads stop working. And that is something that my anxiety helped bring on the shuttering of the first generation that was productivity and tech. The idea that, oh, wow, I have, I'm bringing in hundreds of dollars a month from people who want to hear this podcast. I now have to create content that keeps them happy. And that is the most frustrating thing ever. And and like you said, it can really be draining. And I think about all of the people on YouTube that will tell you, oh, I do this because I love doing it. Or the people that have podcasts that have, tens of thousands of downloads a day that say, oh yeah, I do this because I love doing it. And they make that venture to go freelance or to go solopreneur or, podcasting is their primary source of income. And then it becomes a job. And you start to see the podcast change slowly morphing into this thing of like, okay, let's sell some ads today, and that really sucks. And I think you as a former listener of Isometric and Disruption, of making that decision to stick to your guts and just say, hey, you know what? I'm not about this anymore. I'm gonna kill it now before it becomes something that I hate doing. Because I do believe that if you were still doing that podcast only for the advertisement revenue, there probably wouldn't be an Off Curve. There wouldn't be a Wicked Good stream. Like, that's because that stuff does take time. Like you said, the fact that you started hosting yesterday at like 7 a.m, my time really threw me off and made me slightly angry because I missed 30 minutes, but still, I was like, it's not about me. I'm sure he has a reason. And I even messaged you like, hey, are you going to do another stream this evening so I can catch it? But, ultimately that's not the point. The point is that you're even doing a stream. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted you to be on the show, because one, you were someone that I looked up to as a podcaster. The fact that you had the audacity to just stop a podcast, that I listen to. I mean, come on, I'm so important. But the fact that you were just able to say, you know what, I'm not about this. I'm going to call it quits, and I'm going to do something that I find enjoyable, and I'm going to embrace the small community. That was something that I wish I would have had someone tell me when I was chasing clout as a podcaster. And I thank you for that, and I definitely want to let anyone that is interested in connecting with you further figure out how to do that. So without, I'm done talking until the after show, but please tell everyone how they can connect with you.
Well, I'll do that in a second, but I think something I just want to follow up on one more point that you made, and it's something that I think that is probably good for other people to hear too, and something to take away, like, because one thing, and this kind of what you were saying just kind of triggered this in me, like, my dream was to get on a podcast network originally because I was under the impression that a podcast network would be cross-promoting and would be exposing me to a larger audience. And which is not to, and this is not a criticism of either of the podcast networks that I was on, because it was a misunderstanding on my part of how these things work. And it doesn't matter if it's a podcast network or you want to be a partnered Twitch streamer, or, you want to have, X number of subscribers, you want to be, distributed on YouTube or whatever it is. I think that you get on a podcast network because you have an audience and you're bringing your audience to the network. The network isn't bringing the audience to you. And that's something that I really had backwards in my head for a really long time. And then once I was on a network, I realized, at first I was like, well, why aren't we being cross-promoted more? And then I realized, well, it's not, they can't bring any more listeners to us. Like, there's always an initial boost. And then after that, it's up to us. And you don't need a network for that, right? Like, if that's something you want to do to get that advertising revenue, like, great, do it. Absolutely. If you want to be on a Hearthstone team, do it. But at the end of the day, like, they're not going to do anything for you that you shouldn't already be doing for yourself. And once I realized that, then, and that was long after I left even, like, it's not something that I like realized like while I was there. But once I've realized that, it's made me a lot more at peace with just kind of doing what I want to do and bringing my audience along for the ride. And I'm happy to do it as long as they're willing to keep coming with me. But anyway, I've that's a long-winded way that you should come listen to my podcast. But I do a podcast about Hearthstone, roughly once a week. I mean, I do occasionally skip weeks. Sometimes I'll do 2 episodes in a week. That's the kind of thing I can do now. But it's at offcurve.com, or you can just search for Off Curve, in your podcast client or wherever it happens to be. And, that's where I do my podcast. I also stream usually Sunday nights, though this week I went out to dinner for my parents' anniversary and for my birthday. So I did it during the day, but so I wouldn't be rushing the family back at night, because this is how I balance things. But I do stream Hearthstone as well, at twitch.tv/wickedgoodfm. And I have a Discord, which is linked from all those things. And I also do, I do bring my data architect skills to bear on doing some visualizations of Hearthstone data that's publicly available. I generally do visualizations of major tournament metas, showing what decks and what cards were brought, if that's something that is of interest to you, or if you just want to see that I actually can design a dashboard and not just critique them. That's all at offcurve.com as well. And I'm also on Twitter at WickedGood. That's generally where all my randomness will kind of spill out onto the internet that doesn't get contained in one of those places.
You've been listening to my conversation with Steve Lubitz. I hope you enjoyed that chat. Remember, Steve is streaming on Twitch every now and then, so if you're into Hearthstone, be sure to reach out to him. Either check him out on his stream, which I will provide a link to it on the show notes, or you check out the Off Curve podcast and Discord community. Shout out to Nadir Omawale for the use of his music, A Hustler in Spite of Myself. And once again, a shout out to Steve for being such an awesome guest on the show. By the way, I haven't mentioned this, but I have a new podcast. That's right, I'm doing another one. It's called What I'm. It is a weekday podcast where I talk about my thoughts on current events in technology and life, and I also cover my own personal development as a developer, as a streamer, I guess, as a content creator at large, and as someone who is trying to get a business off the ground. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, be sure to go to my personal website. That is at kjaymiller.com. Click on the link that says Take Me to the What I'm podcast, and be sure to subscribe. Now, we're doing an underground podcast there, so we're not putting it on Apple Music, we're not putting it on Spotify, and honestly, we're not going to put it on YouTube either. And we're doing all of this just because it allows me to have a little bit of creative freedom and not, have something that I'm trying to monetize. But that's going to be it for this week. I am Jay Miller for the Productivity in Tech podcast. I hope we've been productive. I will talk to you next week.